being here. A special thanks to all the members of the Cuba team that have been working non-stop to make today possible, and of course for our partners organizations, the IRI, also the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Thank you so much. The Bacardi Family Foundation, thank you so much for being here with us, and of course the Latin American Youth Network for Democracy that is going to be presented also during today. And with that, I'm very honored to present to you Ambassador Andrew Bremberg from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to give us the case of human rights.
Thank you very much, Maria. As I said, my name is Andrew Bremberg, and I'm proud to be the president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. We are thrilled to partner with you hosting this event today. I'm honored to speak at this second Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for Free Cuba. And thinking about that in my remarks today, I thought, what can I say to bring to this conversation very briefly? We all know that the Cuban regime has oppressed the island for more than 6 decades, and of the vast human rights abuses that take place there on a daily basis. Sadly, we also know that the regime has exported its brand of communism throughout the region, destroying countries in its path, such as Venezuela, and now increasingly in Nicaragua. These facts, both the poisonous ideology of communism and the human rights abuses committed by the regime, are why this Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for a Free Cuba is so important. We in the free world must show our solidarity for those held captive in bondage of communism. And specifically, I wanted to talk today very briefly about the more than 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba. Most of them are prisoners of conscience, people who have been imprisoned for peaceful expression of their political or religious or other beliefs, for their artistic expressions, even though they have never used or advocated violence. On July 11th last year, we witnessed the start of the largest protest movement seen in Cuba in decades. Thousands of Cubans took to the streets across the island, protesting repression and corruption. They demanded freedom and chanted, "Down with the dictatorship, down with communism." The Cuban communist regime has responded with further repression and violence. Without due process or any judicial guarantees, hundreds have been imprisoned and remain in prison, suffering psychological and physical torture, including Jose Daniel Ferrer, a recipient of our organization's Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. Ferrer is a tremendous example of human courage in the face of Cuban communist oppression. Since 2003, he has spent most of his life arbitrarily detained or in permanent political prison. Years in prison, beatings, and torture have deteriorated his health, but have not broken his freedom fighter spirit. Despite his health challenges, the regime keeps him in solitary confinement, keep him up with lights on for 24 hours a day, and not treating multiple diseases and conditions he suffered from. After he was forcibly disappeared again by the Cuban authorities for almost 3 months, when talking with his family, he once again denounced the regime that was murdering him slowly. Similarly, last year we awarded our Dissident Human Rights Award to Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara and Michael Castillo Azorbo, who have been imprisoned in terrible conditions. This past year, they won the Latin Grammys for their contributions to the song Patria Vida. And they have conducted hunger strikes to protest the Cuban prisoners' inhuman treatment. And just thinking about what we saw last summer, this song, which of course won the Latin Grammys, has become the anthem of anti-regime protests in Cuba. The way these 3 prominent political prisoners are being tortured by the Cuban communist regime today should be horrifying to all of us and to anyone of any sense of values or goodwill or democracy. It is also the reason to be more concerned about those Cuban political prisoners I have not mentioned, that we do not know their names, because they are even less protected without being famous or being talked about by Western media or other society. And our commitment to democratic values, to solidarity, must translate into actions that advocate for Cuba's political prisoners. Legislatures and parliamentarians across the free world can and must do more to raise the political and economic cost to the regime for keeping political prisoners in Cuba by building strong coalitions to pressure the regime. We must focus on providing direct support to civil society in Cuba and call for and demand the release of all political prisoners and hold the Cuban regime accountable with targeted sanctions against officials directly involved in jailing and torturing political prisoners. I really urge the U.S. and all other countries that profess to stand for human rights. We must take action and do more in bilateral bases or in multilateral bodies, whether it be the OAS or the UN and the UN's various human rights mechanisms, to raise the issues of human rights violations in Cuba today. It is a shame that both on the U.S. and many freedom-loving countries that we do not, that these forums exist, and we do not press or demand for greater action in UN bodies. In closing, last year, the Victims of Communism Foundation supported the creation of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for a Free Cuba to promote democratic changes. This forum brings together civil society activists, parliamentarians, members of Congress to coordinate actions across both sides of the Atlantic to support all the people of Cuba. I want to again thank Rosa Maria Paya for all of her incredible work in partnership with UNC. And lastly, I want to just invite all of you to the opening of the first Victims of Communism Museum that will be opening here in Washington on June 13th, just 1 month. The new museum, just 2 blocks from the White House, will help educate millions of Americans and all of our visitors about the more than 100 million victims of communist regimes from around the world, and the more than 1.5 billion that are still trapped living under communism today, specifically those trapped by the communist regime. So thank you all for having me. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Member, and we are very pleased also to be joined by members of the Cuban civil society. And before introducing them, I will like to speak a little bit about what is the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum. In November last year, and November last year, the Cuban people were preparing for another round of massive protests that were very hardly cracked by the Cuban regime. In that moment, we believed that the world reaction was not the kind of reaction that the Cuban people deserved, that the Cuban people deserve, and that the Cuban people needs to actually achieve the democracy and the human rights that they are demanding. So we call on our friends, members of the European Parliament, members of European national parliaments, members of the Senate and the Congress of United States, members of the Senate of Canada, and we created the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for a Free Cuba. I said we, but actually the forum is integrated only and exclusively for members of these bodies, and in this occasion, we are pleased to announce that the forum expanded to include members of the legislative bodies of Latin America, and we are here today also in the presence of Felipe Gas, senator from Chile, but we are going to hear also from other senators and congressmen and congresswomen from Latin America via Zoom. What is the goal of the Parliamentary Transatlantic Forum? Well, the goal is to expand the network of support of the Cuban people. Those peoples that were in the street last summer demanding freedom and that today are suffering the repression and the militarization of the whole country just to prevent them from speaking their minds and to prevent this movement for democracy to succeed. These parliamentarians have become advocates for a free Cuba, but with a very specific roadmap, with very specific tasks. In your folders, you can find the Declaración de Miami, the Declaration of Miami. The Declaration of Miami was the foundational document of the forum, and it established several commitments that these parliamentarians have wrote and actually followed during these 6 months from November. Then you can find actions as, well, influence our administrations, our organizations, our governments, for them to create a coalition in support of the Cuban people, for them to denounce the legitimacy of the Cuban regime, for them to establish targeted sanctions against the criminals that are acting against the Cuban people, for them to impose measures as the Sullivan principles for the companies that are still dealing with the Cuban regime not to engage in envision the dictatorships over the human rights of the Cuban people. Each of the members of this parliamentary forum have been following up on those topics. But today, we are also witnessing how the conditions that were already very serious on November last year are actually worse. The Hanke Index, for instance, published in March, that Cuba was the most miserable country, the most miserable country in the world in the year 2021. The Cuban people is actually suffering. There are more than 1,000, I will repeat that, 1,000 political prisoners in jail today. More than 600 trials have took place during the last 6 months. People is being sentenced up to 30 years in prison just for peacefully protesting in the streets right now while we talk. And on the top of that, the Cuban regime has become the best ally of Russia, the best ally of the Putin regime in our region, sparsing, propagating the fake news of the Kremlin through the whole Latin America and Africa. Actually, the Kremlin got as bold as actually threatening with a second Cuban missile crisis, with actually threatening with sending Cuban troops, Russian troops to the island. On the top of that, the influence of the Cuban regime in the rest of the region, especially their collaboration and coordination with the other dictatorships in the region, Venezuela and Nicaragua, have generated the second largest migratory crisis of Cubans entering to the United States in 60 years. More than 80,000 Cubans have irregularly crossed the southern border in the last 6 months, uncounted. On the top of that, last week, we just listened. The president of Mexico announced that he is strengthening his relations with the dictatorship, threatening the United States and the OAS with not coming to the Summit of the Americas in support of those dictatorships that are being causing so much suffering to the Cuban people, and announcing that he is going to make a deal with the Cuban regime to hire more than 500 Cuban doctors. We know that those medical brigades are actually trafficking in person operations. And Mexico is just announcing that that's going to happen. All those topics are topics of of the Transatlantic Parlamentary Forum. All those hard truth needs to be told, and needs to be discussed, and needs to be in the Summit of the America, and needs to be in the European Parliament, and reactions and consequences needs to happen. That's the motivation of the Parliamentary Transatlantic Forum. That's why we are so honored that so many parliamentarians, so many good friends, so many patriots gather to support the Cuban people and to support democracy in Latin America, which is for freedom in the world. And that's why I'm so grateful also to all the members of the Cuban civil society that have been accompanying this process from November, that are also here now, via Zoom and in person, and that are going to brief you and all our distinguished guests about the Cuban situation and about its consequence for the rest of the region. With that, I would love to introduce our dear friend Tony Garrosu from the IRI to explain to us the situation of the religious freedom in Cuba. Please, Tony.
Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you, Rosa Maria, for the invitation. It's really our honor to be able to participate in the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum this morning and among such amazing supporters for a free and democratic Cuba. As a Cuban American, my family came in the 1960s to Miami, so bred in Florida, Miami, Florida. This is very special to my heart and to our institute as well. We are undoubtedly in a very dark moment in the history of Cuba. The armed forces are raging against the Cuban people, and since July 11th, more than 1,000, as many have mentioned, are behind bars for protesting peacefully. Many of those detained are being tried without guarantees, receiving sentences of 20, 30 years, for the sole reason of demanding freedom and respect for fundamental rights. And of course, this includes, as the ambassador was mentioning, renowned artists such as Luis Manuel Alcántara, Miguel, and of course, Jose Daniel Ferre, but also ordinary citizens, mostly coming from low-income families who are being prosecuted, threatened, and harassed really just for speaking their mind. Everyone who thinks differently in Cuba is a target of the Cuban dictatorship. One case in point are the religious leaders. The Cuban Human Rights Observatory conducted a study that will be presented next week, which shows that over 67% of Cubans admit knowing someone who has been harassed, repressed, or threatened for professing a religion or reasons related to their faith. 41% of Cubans believe that pastors and other religious leaders have been particularly targeted for the same reasons. Even more alarming is that 60% of the people who profess a religion consider it a risk to discuss faith-related issues in written forms, such as, for example, blogs, posts on Facebook, Twitter, or just talk about their faith with people other than their family members. The same risk is also present in gatherings with other religious people. Censorship in Cuba and restrictions on internet access are also an alarming fact today. In prisons and the streets, the Cuban people are already on the verge of despair. For example, there's a massive migration of Cubans who risk their lives to reach the United States, as correctly pointed out. The people of Cuba are really in a precarious situation, and the Cuban dictatorship continues to impede its people from achieving any possibility to prosper. Cuba is not the paradise of social rights that the dictatorship sells, and that many, unfortunately, still buy. That's why these forums are extremely, extremely important to be able to get the truth out there. According to a report on social rights by the Cuban Human Rights Observatory, findings show that 70% of Cuban families live below the poverty line, subsisting on less than $1.30 a day. The same study revealed that 8 out of 10 Cubans cannot get medicines in the state pharmacy. This is supposed to be a social paradise, right? Now, the Cuban government is not in favor of workers' rights either, as they claim to be. Over 55% of tourism workers believe they have been discriminated, and 72% of them say it was because of their political ideas. That is what actually Cuba represents today: discrimination, poverty, persecution, harassment, and above all, constriction of freedoms and the right of what they want for their future and for their nation. It's basically a nation kidnapped kidnapped by a family and a group of militaries. This is only happening within a few miles of our own borders. And unfortunately, the efforts of the international community have failed to change course. This is why we are suggesting 3 elements that we believe are crucial at this time. First, to continue to call for the liberation of political prisoners. Thousands of people in jail with unfair trials really cannot be tolerated. The country should strongly demand that the Cuban dictatorship, I hate to call it the regime, the dictatorship, respect for human rights and freedom of expression. Second, protect the leaders who are still inside and expand access to the internet in order to communicate with the outside and denounce what is happening on the inside. And third, and I think most importantly, work for a more unified, strong, and determined action by the international community against the Cuban dictatorship, so that these violations do not go unpunished. This is one of the reasons why we're supporting this event. I think it's extremely important. We think it's an important, extremely important symbol to host it in this amazing institution today. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few words and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. I would love to invite Pastor Mario Felix Leonard to tell us a few words just to illustrate what Tony was just telling you about the situation of the religious freedom in Cuba, especially the situation of those who dare to practice their faith. Please, Mario.
Sí, que my English is very bad.
Puedes hablar en español y
no sabes. Gracias. Muchas gracias a Rosa María y también a todos los organizadores de este Foro Transatlántico.
Thank you very much, Rosa Maria, and all these organizers of the Transatlantic Forum.
Agradecemos a los parlamentarios que desde noviembre han apoyado la causa de Cuba.
We're grateful to all the parliamentarians that since November have supported the cause of freedom in Cuba.
De noviembre hasta la fecha las cosas se han agravado.
From November to the present day, things have gotten worse.
Por lo tanto, necesitamos aún más su apoyo.
Therefore, we need even more your support.
Respecto a la situación de libertades religiosas que habló Tony, yo quiero también poner ejemplos.
And with respect to religious freedoms that Tony spoke about, I also want to give some examples.
Debo decir que pronto, desde el 11 de julio, el Instituto PACU, que yo coordino desde el 2013, va a publicar un informe especial que va a intentar reflejar los pasados 2 años respecto a esta situación.
I should say that prior to July 11th, the Patmos Institute, which I direct, that has been around since 2013, will release a report over the past 2 years on these topics.
Independientemente de que en Cuba, durante la historia de la revolución, nunca hemos tenido libertades religiosas, en estos 2 últimos años se han agravado especialmente por 4 causas fundamentales.
Independently that within Cuba during the revolution we never had religious freedom, over the last 2 years this has been aggravated for the 4 following reasons.
El contexto de la pandemia durante 2020 y 2021 que afectó al mundo entero.
The context of the pandemic from 2020 to 2021 that has affected the entire world.
Y que afectó todas las libertades de todos los países, aún los más democráticos, con más razón los países donde hay dictadura.
And affected freedoms even in the most democratic countries, but even more so in countries where there is dictatorship.
Sí, la segunda causa fue la política de ordenamiento o reordenamiento económico que se puso en vigor en enero del 2021.
And the second was the policy of ordering or reordering the economy that began in 2021.
Esto puso una camisa de fuerzas a una de las denominaciones legalmente registradas.
This put a straitjacket on denominations, even those that are registered with the government.
Intentando asfixiarlas económicamente.
Attempting to suffocate them economically.
La tercera causa fue el hecho que todos ustedes conocen y que Tony y todos los demás han hecho referencia. El 11 de julio.
And the third is the action, which all of you know about, that Tony also referenced, which is July 11th.
Entre los miles de presos se destacaron creyentes de todas las confesiones religiosas.
Among the thousands of prisoners, there were believers of all the different faiths.
La dictadura se ensañó en algunos de estos líderes para enviar un escarmiento a todas las confesiones religiosas.
The dictatorship targeted a number of these leaders to send a message to these different faith-based communities.
Quiero mencionar el caso
fundamentales.
I want to mention three critical cases.
En el caso de las minorías religiosas, efectivamente, el caso específico de los yorubas libres de Cuba.
I want to mention three specific minority religious groups, the Free Yoruba of Cuba being the first.
Tenemos el matrimonio líder de esta minoría religiosa. Se trata de Loreto Hernández García y de su esposa Donaida Pérez Paceño, ambos condenados a 8 años de prisión. Sí, Donaida Pérez Paceño. Sí.
Yes, and I want to highlight the case of the couple, Lorena Hernandez and Donaida
Pérez Paceño. Ellos,
both were sentenced to 8 years in prison.
ellos representan las religiones afrocubanas y contra ellos el ensañamiento contra esa minoría religiosa.
And they represent Afro-Cuban religions, and they have been targeted and represent that targeting the American community.
Un católico muy prominente, Ángel Mesa, de Guanajay, ha sido el católico escogido para enviar el escarmiento a los católicos cubanos. Está condenado a 14 años de prisión.
Alejandro Mesa, a Catholic leader, has been sentenced to 14 years, and that they are sending a message to the Catholic community with this sentence.
Y en el caso de los evangélicos cubanos, el pastor Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo, que fue condenado a 7 años de prisión y que ha sido torturado.
¿Cuántos años de prisión?
7 años. Lorenzo Rosales Fajardo.
And then in the evangelical community, we have Lorenzo González Vargas, who was sentenced to 7 years in prison and has been tortured.
Y por último, les había dicho que 4 causas han agravado, les he hablado de 3. La última de las causas ha sido precisamente la guerra de Ucrania, ya que todas las confesiones religiosas cubanas se han puesto del lado del pueblo ucraniano y han defendido al pueblo de Ucrania en contraste con la posición de la dictadura. Pero esto ha traído más persecución a los líderes religiosos cubanos.
And the fourth cause for increased religious repression is the war in Ukraine, because all of these religious groups have taken the side of Ukraine in the war, in contrast to the position of the government, and that is involved in repression.
A pesar de esto, los cristianos cubanos y de otras denominaciones siguen multiplicándose y siguen siendo una amenaza, y así lo reconoce la dictadura en Cuba.
Despite this, Christians continue to grow in number, as well as other faiths, and the regime recognizes this as a threat.
Han surgido agrupaciones como la Alianza de Iglesias Cubanas No Registradas o Cristianos Cubanos en Comunión y otros grupos diversos.
La Alianza
de Iglesias Cubanas No Registradas.
The alliance, other groups have emerged, like the Alliance of Non-Registered Churches and
Cristianos Cubanos en Comunión.
And Christian Cubans in Communion.
Sí. Podría darle más elementos, pero solamente les invito a que se mantengan atentos para cuando el Instituto Palmo publique este informe que se va a basar en estas 4 causas de estos últimos años para reflejar que efectivamente las libertades religiosas en Cuba han empeorado en su situación.
I could go into further detail, but I just want to highlight that Capitals will be releasing a report touching on these 4 causes of increased religious repression over the past 2 years, and I invite you to read it.
Sí, una línea más es que, aparte de este informe del IBIS, que lo demuestra, prestigiosas organizaciones internacionales han puesto a la dictadura en Cuba como una violadora de las libertades religiosas. Puedo citar Open Doors, que este año, después de 10 años con Cuba ausente de la lista, ha vuelto a poner a Cuba en el número 37 de los países de 50 más violadores de libertades religiosas.
And I also want to point out that prestigious international organizations have also, in addition to IRI, have highlighted the increase in religious repression. For example, Open Doors, that for 10 years did not have Cuba on its list, this year has placed Cuba 35th out of 50 in terms of religious repression.
Y la Comisión de Libertad Religiosa Internacional, que mantiene a Cuba en su lista de vigilancia especial.
Comisión
de Libertad Religiosa Internacional, que mantiene a Cuba en su lista de libertad de vigilancia especial de países violadores.
And the Commission of International Religious Freedom that has Cuba under observation in terms of countries violating religious freedoms.
Thank you so much, Mario. Thank you so much, John, for that translation. We welcome Senator Rita Scott to the room. Thank you so much for being with us. And with that, I would love to pass to some of the members of the Cuban Civil Society that have been joining us for soon. And I pass the floor to Ramon Saúl Sánchez, that is from El Movimiento Democracia, and is going to briefly talk to us about the migratory crisis that we are confronting right now. Thank you, Ramon. No te dimos, Ramón, wait. ¿Nos escuchas, Ramón?
Un segundo.
Perdónenos.
Un segundo.
All right, while we figure out what's going on with our son, I invite you, John Suarez from the Center for a Free Cuba, to briefly brief us on the situation of human rights in Cuba and its consequences.
Thank you, Rosa. It's an honor to be here with you today. As others have said, July 11th, 2021, national nonviolent protests in Cuba marks a smart act in Cuban history. Tens of thousands of Cubans across the island demanded an end to the dictatorship, rejected the official slogan "Patria Muerte, Homeland or Death," and chanted "Patria Vida, Homeland and Life." The reaction of the totalitarian dictatorship was swift and brutal. The Buenas Negras, Black Berets, formerly known as the National Special Brigade of the Ministry of the Interior, were captured on video firing on unarmed protesters. The dictatorship handed out clubs to regime agents to attack demonstrators. Thousands of nonviolent protesters were detained. Hundreds remain jailed, facing summary trials with prison sentences in excess of 25 years. The lack of transparency in Cuba has taken on a new urgency in the current context. The International Committee of the Red Cross has not been allowed in Cuban prisons since 1989, and that was a brief period between 1988 and 1989. In comparison, the prison for Al-Qaeda prisoners at the U.S. Guantanamo Naval Base had over 100 visits between 2002 and 2014, and continues to the present day. Cuba is the only country in the Americas where Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and other international and regional human rights organizations are unable to visit. We remain deeply concerned with the plight of political prisoners such as Virgilio Mantilla Arango, Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, and Michael Castillo Perez Osorbo, and their health status. It is also no coincidence that all are Black Cubans. The one Cuban that the Cuban government recognized was killed during the protest on July 12, 2021, was Luis Lorenzo Tejeda, an unarmed 36-year-old Black man who was shot in the back by a Castro regime official. The largest numbers of Cubans arrested and processed following the July protest are from predominantly Black neighborhoods such as La Munera, which government officials call marginal. These and other cases raise questions about the racist nature of the Castro regime. According to the January 13, 2020 article by Europa Press, based on the Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research, Cuba today has the largest per capita prison population in the world. Although official data is unavailable, it is known that a disproportionate number are Black Cubans. On March 22, 1959, Fidel Castro declared that racism no longer existed in Cuba. To contradict the maximum leader was to be a counter-revolutionary and subsequent punishment. Over the next 6 decades, the communist dictatorship claimed that there was no racism in Cuba, despite the fact that poverty disproportionately affects Black Cubans, with 95% having the lowest incomes compared to 58% of white Cubans, and Black voices continue to be silenced. This is another reason why we are calling on the UN General Assembly members to expel Cuba from the UN Human Rights Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for pointing out that very hard reality of the price system of the Cuban regime and how that impacts also the whole political movement and the way in which they crack down on the protesters. I think that we now are ready for this one.
Okay.
Yes. Please, Ramon, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank all the parliamentarians and legislators and Congress representatives that are here today, and also some have connected through electronic means to this very important forum. The Cuban people have suffered 63 years of tyranny and family destruction and death and execution, torture, and exile, and to have voices that want to spread out the word that that dictatorship should stop and that we should be free is something that we will always cherish in our hearts. Thank you. Thank you, Rosa Maria and Cuba Decide, for bringing us together. Your dignity and your efforts always are able to gather the will of a lot of good people in the right cause. The democracy movement that I represent introduced the nonviolent approach 30-some years ago, and we do the flotillas to go to near Cuba. We promote nonviolent changes inside Cuba, but with time, and for the last 30 or so, almost 40 years, we have come to be a source of information for the relatives of the Cubans, Cuban rafters who are forced to leave the island seeking freedom. My phone has received thousands of calls throughout the years. One day I received 70 calls in one Sunday of anguished relatives in Miami that don't know if their loved ones who left Cuba in a raft are dead or were dead or were picked up interdicted by the U.S. Coast Guard or landed somewhere in another country. This is a constant of the present regime. Before this regime, less than a fraction of 1% lived outside Cuba, about 50,000 people. After this regime, 30% of Cuba's population lives in exile, and unfortunately, more and more every day. Because the Cuban regime utilizes exodus as a tool of political gains. It utilizes not only the lives of people, but even the death of people that they cause to achieve certain political and economic purposes. Among those things is to, of course, relieve the internal pressure from the discontent of the population with that inept and dictatorial regime. Another element that they use the exodus for is to sit the United States in the table of negotiations to obtain concessions, utilizing the Cuban people at the expense of the lives of the Cuban people. They have become very able in doing this. And every time it works because unfortunately there are some in the free world that are willing to succumb to those techniques that the regime uses, and they rather deal with the symptoms than going to the root of the problem. Another issue of why they stimulate the exodus is to replenish the industry that they have established with the division of the Cuban family that allows them about $6 billion a year from the paying of the Cuban families, from the family division. But there's another one now. The regime is utilizing the exodus as a weapon of war, as a tool of war. Why am I saying this? Because apparently The Cuban regime, according to certain indicators that we have been able to observe and to confirm, the Cuban dictator may be engaged in this exodus to please the Russian imperialism, the world criminal Vladimir Putin, in retaliation for the U.S. support for the Ukrainian people. They are trying to create a crisis in the U.S. backyard to some degree, put pressure on the administration, especially facing the midterms election, to see what they can get from that. Many of you might not know that for the first time, a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a boat loaded with Russians, with a suitcase made and everything, landed in Key West. Very strange. The phones were sanitized, strong indicators that there were not only plain Russian individuals who leaving Russia or through Cuba to come to the United States. Maybe some of them were, but they could be others that are not. So the Cuban regime utilized this exodus, and it will continue to do so. Many months ago, we began saying to the authorities here and publicly, there is an exodus coming, because we began to obtain information, and because with 40 years of experience in the issue, we were already seeing the symptoms. Now we're saying this is not going to stop here. It is going to continue. The regime is going to try to achieve, through the death of people, with family division, more goals of for economic purposes and for political purposes. I think this form.
Thank you. Ramon, is he listening to us?
Yes, he is. Yes.
Mic.
You got muted? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, can you hear me there?
Yes, we get you. Thank you so much for those remarks, and thank you for those very specific facts on how the Cuban regime is once again weaponizing the Cuban people to obtain concessions from the U.S. and also to release pressure. We are going to continue to listen from the Cuban civil society, but before, I would like to pass the floor to Senator Rick Scott. For us, is of course an honor to have you in this Transatlantic Parlamentarian Forum. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thanks for the opportunity here with recognize my friend, the Congressman Carlos Sabenas, who we've been able to work. We basically got elected about the same time. Mayor and Governor of Florida, we had the opportunity to work in that position, and since we both came up here about the same time. I first want to begin by remembering the families who lost loved ones in the devastating explosion at the Hotel Saratoga in Havana. We continue to pray that they are comforted, and that any missing victims are quickly found and hopefully found alive. As Governor of Florida and for the past 3 years as Senator, I've had the chance to talk with many Cubans living in Florida and across the country who risked their lives to leave the brutal oppression of Cuba. Many of them, most of them, came here with nothing, scarred by the oppression of the regime, but hoping for a new life. But what little they had, they started businesses and built a thriving community, not only in Miami, not only in Florida, but across the country. I witnessed their resolve to fight for freedom, support their families, and contribute to their communities. They're examples of the American dream and testimonies to the ills of communism and socialism. The Cuban people are a source of inspiration for all of us. They show us what can be accomplished when you have freedom and opportunity. That's why we continue to fight for the end of communism in Cuba, for the freedom and liberties of every Cuban family. Here in Washington, we need to continue doing everything we possibly can to support the freedom movement in Cuba. We need to treat Diaz-Canel and the Castros as the thugs they are. You can look at just recently what they're talking about with regard to Russian invasion of Ukraine. Cuba is criticizing NATO for stepping up to prevent further Russian aggression. When an American journalist was killed while covering the fighting, Cuba State media lied and said he was the CIA. They're downplaying Russia's abuses as Congress gives them sweetheart debt financing deals. So Russia's committing genocide in Ukraine, and Cuba's helping them lie about it. You can see that cities like Mariupol have just been leveled. seeing mass graves filled with the bodies of Ukrainians, done nothing to deserve this attack. And Cuba is playing right along with it. You can look at the Cuban regime and start, pro-democracy activists on the island like Jose Daniel Ferrer, ladies in white. I've spoken with Jose Daniel Ferrer's family. They told me he's been subjected to physical and psychological torture and attempt to end his life. I asked the White House to intervene back in December, and they hung up on him. He's suffering from severe headaches, mouth bleeding, malnutrition, coughing, all products of the kill, torture, and inhumane treatment of the Cuban regime. But it's not just him. There's about 1,300 innocent demonstrators in prison since last July. They're doing everything they can to persecute, kidnap, torture, kill anyone who stands up. It's horrible what they're doing. I'm doing with kids as young as 14 years old. I think of Shirley Avialion. After Obama's appeasement, the secret police in Cuba came to her house with a machete and chopped her hand off and then stuck in the mud so she would get an infection. And you know what she did wrong? She complained that a school in her area was going to be closed. So appeasement does not work. I was proud when a few months ago the Senate unanimously passed my resolution condemning the torture of Jose Daniel Ferrer and calling on the international community to stand up finally for the Cuban people against the authoritarian regime. I was just in Poland 2 weeks ago talking to some Polish leaders, and they had no idea how bad the Cuban regime was. We need to do everything we can to stop supporting their abuses and bolster their economy. We've got to make sure everybody in Europe knows what's going on. I've been pressuring the Biden administration to lift the legal immunity of PACU, who's helped the Cuban regime traffic doctors overseas. I've urged major travel agencies across the world, but especially in Europe, to stop advertising trips to Cuba. I've spoken with leaders of OAS, which has shown up to try to be helpful, and the UN about Jose Daniel's case. That's why I called on President Biden to not only allow Diaz-Canel and his thugs to not allow Diaz-Canel and his thugs to attend the upcoming Summit of the Americas. I was disappointed to hear last week we had Congress or Homeland Security Committee meeting, and I asked the State Department about the current discussions with the Cuban leaders. I asked them, are they willing to review sanctions, or are they willing to take Cuba off the terrorist watch, sponsor terrorism list? They wouldn't answer. So we have to assume the worst. It's unacceptable. The Americans is actually going to be the greatest beacon for freedom and democracy around the world. We have to actually do something for it. We all have a role to play. I want to thank all of you for what you work to promote a new day of freedom for the Cuban people. You can't imagine anybody would want to treat people the way the Cuban regime treats people. I want to thank all the legislators who have traveled here. I want to thank Congressman Diaz-Balart, Congressman Jimenez, Maria Salazar, and Rubio for all their hard work to support the Cuban people. And thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a voice for the political prisoners. Thank you so much for each action that you have mentioned that are also in fulfillment of the commitments of the Parliamentary Transatlantic Forum. We really appreciate your voice in the Senate. We really appreciate that resolution in favor of Jose Daniel Ferrer, and also the resolution that the Senate unanimously passed to rename the street in front of the Cuban embassy, honoring my father, Oswaldo Payá, who will be 70 years old today if the Cuban regime weren't killed him 10 years ago. So thank you so much, Senator. And with that, I would love to pass the floor to Salomé Garcia Bacallao, that have been working to tell us all the details on the Cuban political prisoners, on the young Cubans that have been sent to jail just for peacefully protesting on the streets. Salomé, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm part of Justicia Segunda. It's a group of researchers, journalists, and Cuban lawyers that have been documenting all the detentions in relation to the July 11th protests. Since I last addressed this forum last November, the total number of people detained that our group has documented increased by 200 to 1,452, and also the number of people who remain in jail to 743. The reason is that every time that an unjust sentencing is published, one more family decides to break the silence. In November, most of the trials had not taken place. Until today, we have registered 555 trials, and at least 84 more protesters are pending trials still. This number is inferior to the official number offered by the General Prosecutor's Office of the Cuban Republic. They say that 790 protesters have been processed. We are concerned by the hundreds of cases that we have not been able to document yet. Only 5 people have been acquitted, and 510 have received sentencings from 8 months to 30 years in prison, for a total of over 4,500 years of prison. Only 28 people have received sanctions that don't include jail, such as correctional work without internation and limited freedom. The tribunals have taken sometimes more than 4 months to publish these sentencings, prolonging the suffering of these families. These trials have taken place without any respect for the most basic guarantees of due process, without access to independent lawyers, with militarized tribunals, and violating the right to publicity. Many of the judges and prosecutors implied in these processes have been trained by the Russian government. On January 31, 14 families of protesters and activists, including one of the coordinators from our group, were arbitrarily detained outside the tribunal of 10 de Octubre just for linking their hands together and screaming, "Freedom, they are heroes," when the protesters were leaving the trial. In this trial, precisely 7 of the 22 minors that have been processed since, according to our records, were in this trial. Most of the minors have been processed for the political crime of sedition. I would like to tell you some of their names and sanctions. Kendry Miranda, sentenced to 19 years in prison. Roland Castillo Castro to 18 years in prison. Lázaro Noel Urgelles to 14 years in prison. Brandon David Becerra Curvelo to 13 years. And Emilio Slan Roman to 7 years. All of them were detained when they were 17 years. Other 6 minors are waiting trial. Between them is Jonathan Torres Farrat, who turned 17 years on July 11th, and who has the prosecutor is asking for 8 years in prison. At least other 5 children between the ages of 12 and 15 years will be very soon completing a year of reclusion in detention centers managed by the Ministry of Interior, and they didn't even have a right to being defended by a lawyer or to a fair trial, because this is an administrative sanction. They were also subject of questioning without the presence of their parents or lawyers. Some of these minors have chronic diseases such as hypertension, and many of them have contracted dengue, scabies, COVID, hepatitis in prison, and they have been denied medical attention. The experience of 56 minors that in total were detained for this protest is not an isolated situation in Cuba, but a systematic practice violating the Convention of the Children's Rights signed and ratified by the Cuban state. In a report for the UN, Cuba admitted that in 2020, at least 662 kids between 16 and 18 years were in prisons, most of them Black or mestizos. They live there with adult prisoners who have been sanctioned for common crimes such as thefts, or homicide. On the other hand, the average, in average, these detention centers administered by the Ministry of Interior for kids under 16 have around 200 minors, for a total of 2,000 children under the care of the Ministry of Interior. Also in prison remain 72 women for this protest. Activist Lisandra Góngora, a mother of 5 children, is one of them. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison for the crime against state security of sabotage. She's one of over 60 people who have been brought to military tribunals for vandalizing MLC stores during the worst economic crisis that the Cuban people has experienced in the last 30 years. These military establishments where the government sells food are owned by CIMEX and GAESA, which are military entities sanctioned by the US government, and that contribute to the practice of social and economic segregation by the Cuban regime, denying people the right to acquire food with the money, with the currency that they earn with their work. The Cuban regime has also used this protests to incarcerate a great number of activists from groups such as UNPACU, Las Damas de Blanco, el Movimiento de Opositores por una Nueva República, Otro 18, Independiente y Democrática, and not only the most visible faces such as José Daniel Ferrer or Félix Navarro and Sutter Saidi, from amongst the 8 people who are still in prison in relation to the call to protest on November 15, half of them are activists. Also in prison for this call to
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Salome, for that accountability of the amount of Cubans that are suffering political prisoners, the amount of women that are suffering political prisoners, the children that are in prison right now just for peacefully protesting in Cuba, and the fact that our voices needs to be raised in defense of these brave Cubans that were only demanding freedom in a peaceful way. For us, it's an honor to be joined today by Congressman Carlos Jiménez, that from his first day in the job has been an advocate of the cause of freedom for Cuba, also its motherland. And we would love to hear from you, Congressman.
Thank you very much, Rosalia, and I want to thank Senator Scott for his words, and also I want to also thank Mario Diaz-Balart, and Senator Marco Rubio for being staunch supporters of the cause of free Cuba since my time here. Only been here about a year and a half, and I'm getting to know the ropes, but for me personally, I was born in Cuba, and I got a little taste of what communism was about. I was being indoctrinated as a young boy in kindergarten in a very prominent school called Belén, which is the one that actually Fidel Castro wanted. And that's the reason why my parents brought me here, because they figured out being indoctrinated. And I can't help but thank my parents so much for bringing me here to this land of freedom and opportunity. Where else could you, what other country could you go from exile to Congress, like one generation? I don't think it happened anywhere else. That's why I love this country so much. And while I love Cuba, and that's the country of my birth, I also see Cuba as a threat to the safety and security of the people of the United States, and the safety and security of the people of Latin America and Central America. Cuba is the head of the snake. Cuba is the cancer. And we thought we had Cuba in a little island, and that cancer was going to be spreading in that little island, and it's going to stay there, but it's not. Right? That cancer is spreading. That cancer already spread to Venezuela. That cancer spread to Nicaragua. That cancer is spreading to all parts of South America. And that, yes, that cancer may be even spreading here. You're seeing some of the same tactics that I saw parents saw in Cuba. Censorship, trying to shut down the voices of dissent. That's why I'm a huge proponent for free speech. The only way to combat disinformation is not by saying this is disinformation. The only way to combat disinformation is with other information, real information, and let people decide for themselves what's right or what's wrong. So, as I see here in the United States in the Hall of Congress, Secretary of Homeland Security himself, the Cuban Senate, asking for a ministry of disinformation. It's outrageous. Those are the same tactics that we see, in Cuba and dictators around the world. So it's time now for freedom-loving countries, the countries that are democratic and free, to notice, to finally realize that Cuba is a threat. And Cuba is a threat to them, to us. And it's time to cut them out. Don't deal with them, shut them down economically, impose embargoes, even greater embargoes. And we also have to do something what's going on here in the United States. Unfortunately, while these are the things that we have to do, we should be doing to protect our liberties here in the United States and around the world and in South America. And finally, bring it to Cuba. All right. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening. This administration has opened the borders that we have allowed, again, thousands and thousands of Cubans to come in through the southern border. And while I understand their plight, it's also that this is a escape route for the Cubans, so that the dissent is allowed to escape and therefore they're allowed to survive more and more and more. We need to end the scourge of the Cuban dictatorship once and for all. And we need to do that not only for the Cuban people, but for the freedom-loving people in this hemisphere and around the world. Now, what they're doing with Russia is just a continuation of what they've always done with the old Soviet Union. They're puppets of the Soviet Union. They are the proxies, and they will continue to do that. And believe me, the Soviet Union is not a friend of the United States. And the Soviet Union is not a friend of freedom around the world, as they've so demonstrated with their invasion of Ukraine. And I got to take my hat off to the Ukrainian people for fighting and saying no to Russia and pushing them back. And hopefully America needs to continue to support freedom-loving people of Ukraine. And hopefully we can do the same thing for the freedom-loving people of Cuba and support them. So I get a little emotional, probably because it's personal. My father and mother, God rest their soul, they never got to see Cuba, the land that they so loved. Cuba had one of the highest standards of living in 1958 in the world. And today, it's rated the most miserable country in the world. Why anybody would want to, replicate what they are doing in Cuba is beyond me. It's beyond me. But we have people in also this Congress that actually are okay with what's going on in Cuba. And I will fight that, to my dying breath. So again, thank you for having me here. And again, I think that what you're doing is fantastic. But again, people, parliamentarians, legislators from around the world, especially the European Union, you should now see what Cuba is all about. Now that they're totally allied with Russia, which is really posing a threat to you directly. Cuba's their proxy right here. And if we were up to Cuba, we'd have more of that around the world. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your time, Congressman. And for that very clear alert that you are sending not only to your colleagues here in the US, but also to the European Union, the European Parliament, the European national parliaments, and that's why this Parliament is that significant, because this is the place in which we can you can actually coordinate actions with a very specific goal that you said is the freedom of a nation that want to be democratic, of a people that only want access to human rights. Thank you so much. We have 2 more witnesses from the Cuban civil society that I would love for you to listen. And with that, I will pass the floor to Orlando Gutiérrez from the Directorio Democrático Cubano. Gracias, Orlando.
Thank you, Cuba City and Jose Maria, for inviting me to this forum. My message is very brief. The message is that the reality is that it's the European Union financing the regime in Cuba. Whereas China has forgiven 2.8 billion of the Cuban debt, the Paris Club has forgiven 8.5 billion. Whereas China has given the regime 1.8 billion in loans, the European Union, through its cooperation agreement, gave the regime 61.5 billion in investment for development in 2019 and 60 billion since 2020. So the hard currency, the cash the regime is using for its day-to-day operations and for repression is coming precisely from the European Union. And I think it's a very sad state of affairs that whereas there's unity between the U.S. and the European Union to confront Russian aggression against Ukraine, the number one ally of the Russian Federation in the Western Hemisphere is being financed by the European Union. As long as this persists, as long as this open-ended financing of the regime exists, by the democracies of the European Union, repression will continue in Cuba, and the regime will always see light at the end of the tunnel. So I find that it's a glaring moral fault of Europe to be financing this regime, which all of us in this panel have listed as a regime that has committed crimes against humanity and continues to subvert democracy throughout the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Orlando, and we really appreciate that alert. You mentioned the Paris Club in the first meeting of this parliamentary forum, and now the threat is even bigger because the Cuban regime is posing even a bigger threat to the stability of several countries and of course to the Cuban people. Thank you so much. And with that, Hugo Asha from the Fundación de Derechos Humanos de Cuba. Please, Hugo, you have the floor.
Absolutely. I want to first and foremost thank you, Rosa. Thanks every single parliamentarian that is here with us, from senators, representatives, congressmen from different European bodies. Orlando said something that is extremely paramount. Let me summarize this. If you believe that the war in Ukraine is an isolated European conflict, you're dead wrong. And this is extremely relevant for the cause of Cuban freedom. If you do not understand Cuba in the context of its role, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but globally, you are risking a lot of nasty surprises. Just in all what I'm going to mention right now, it's backed with hard evidence. It was mentioned just a second ago that Cuba is the #1 ally of the Russian regime. That is not an exaggeration. The only country in the world, as of today, lobbying actively for the recognition of the separatist republics of Donetsk and Luhansk is Cuba. The only country doing so, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in Africa, is Cuba. The country that has propelled the most aggressive campaign, shaping, propelling, justifying the Russian propaganda and the Russian aggression is Cuba. Prensa Latina, Granma, are the open sources used all over Latin America. Most open source press, multimedia, TV stations, and other sources are basing their reports all over this continent in that content. To the point that Vika Chagatsova, Vice President of the European Parliament, addressed a letter to Joseph Borrell just yesterday mentioning this point. Cuba is also one of the main sources that allow the Russian regime to evade formal sanctions. The involvement of Cuban authorities, including diplomats, to facilitate illicit circuits all over the world, not only including Latin America or the Western Hemisphere, but Africa and Europe, are part of this regime. So if you want to fight for the cause of Cuba, if you want to help every single name that has been mentioned during this, I would say, brilliant series of explanations, and as not a footnote, but something that should become a cause célèbre for my friends from European parliaments, I want to mention the name of Luis Prometa Conte, a Cuban national, but also a German national, who has been sentenced to 25 years in prison. His crime, According to some very credible reports, he recorded the assassination of one of the peaceful protesters at the hand of Cuban security forces. I really call you to help in every way, shape, or form the Frometa Comte family to obtain freedom, not only for every single one of the very relevant activists like José Daniel Ferrer, Michael Osorbo, and every single name mentioned here, but also for this person who, again, it's another peaceful protester. And finally, we were talking about children. We need to be aware of how this affects every single piece of international law that's relevant worldwide. You have persons that right now have been sentenced or will be sentenced to terms that actually are superior to their lifetime. It's something morally, legally, and under any basic tenet or principle, unacceptably wrong. So with that in mind, I again want to call your attention to this fact. If you want to help the cause of Cuban freedom, remember how important and relevant the role of the Cuban dictatorship is in sustaining and supporting instability, conflict, and as of today, the war in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that remarks, Hugo. And with that, I will pass the floor to the last testimony of the morning. I'm talking about Marta Beatriz Ferrer, the daughter of José Daniel Ferrer, leader of the Unión Patriótica de Cuba, and one of the prisoners of July 11. Marta? Okay, well, we wait for Marta Beatriz to fix the camera. I would like for all of us to listen to the remarks that Senator Posadas from Canada has sent to us. Senator Posadas is a founder of this forum. He has been working very close with Mr. Michael Lima from Democratic Spaces, from the Cuban diaspora in Canada. And he cannot be here with us today, but he sent this video talking to us about the challenge that he has found in Canada.
Buenos dias. Thank you. I'm delighted to join you at this second session of the forum in Washington, D.C., hosted by the Pan American Foundation for Democracy and Cuba Decide, in solidarity with its global alliance for democracy. I want to take this opportunity to greet my colleagues in the United States and Europe and give a special welcome to the new members who have joined from Uruguay, Bolivia, Chile, and Costa Rica. I'll start by reiterating my commitment to the objectives of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Coalition for a Free Cuba, inaugurated in Miami on November 20, 2021. Because defense of democracy and condemnation of oppression in Cuba and elsewhere is a global struggle that must transcend borders, ideologies, and political parties. Canada and all democratic nations have a moral duty to listen to the voices of the people of Cuba as expressed by hundreds of thousands of brave Cubans across the island who peacefully took to the streets on July 11, 2021. Cubans on that occasion made clear their absolute rejection of the dictatorial communist system on the island and their desire to live in democracy. They understood that the root of Cuba's social, economic, and political problems, the chronic shortage of food and medicine, the crumbling healthcare system, the human rights catastrophe they face lay in the obsolete, repressive, exclusionary, and centralized economic policies of the communists. Civil society fighting for democracy in Cuba is cornered by the regime's extensive surveillance and repression apparatus. Thousands of Cubans were arbitrarily arrested on July 11th and in subsequent days. Today, there are more than 1,000 political prisoners on the island, including women and children. So far in the first quarter of 2022, human rights NGOs have reported thousands of repressive actions by the Cuban regime, including arbitrary arrests, harassment, fines, and forced expatriation. And now, in addition to existing repressive laws, the regime plans to implement a new penal code with even harsher penalties for political dissent. Meanwhile, impunity is rampant, and none of the members of the repressive forces responsible for murders, beatings, and torture have been brought before the court. That is why the Transatlantic Parliamentary Coalition is so important. International solidarity is imperative for the triumph of democracy. If we turn our backs on the Cuban people and do not show international solidarity, it is not possible for democracy to be reborn in Cuba. In Canada, I've been honored to work with the freedom-loving Cuban Canadian community. In several meetings with them, I have noted how they are the best ambassadors of the people of Cuba in their struggle for democracy. Together with a community of freedom-loving Canadians of Cuban descent and important voices of solidarity from the Conservative Party parliamentarians, we have taken steps to make the main points of the Miami Declaration a reality. On March 24th, I was proud to table a motion in the Senate of Canada that introduces key points of the Miami Declaration. The motion denounces the legitimacy of Cuba's dictatorial regime, urges the government of Canada to support opposition groups on the island as valid interlocutors in Canada-Cuba relations, and calls on the Senate of Canada and the executive of our government to support the Cuban people's right to free expression and peaceful demonstration without any fear of reprisal. The motion was supported by the Conservative Party Senate. Unfortunately, it is currently languishing on the order paper, awaiting action from a majority of Trudeau government-appointed parliamentarians. And along with other Conservative parliamentarians such as Pierre Poilievre and Mr. Pierre Paulus, we have taken part in public demonstrations organized by the Cuban community in support of democracy in Cuba. We have also been drawing attention to the moral and ethical implications of vacationing and investing money in Cuba and how it contributes to propping up the repressive apparatus used to persecute journalists, artists, human rights defenders, and critics of the regime. We believe that in the current global context, and due to the close relationship of the Cuban regime as a key ally of dictator Vladimir Putin in Russia, vacationing and investing in Cuba is tantamount to giving support to the human rights predatory regime that, in addition to unleashing repression against its own people, uses all its state-controlled media on the island to reproduce the Kremlin's disinformation machine on the invasion of Ukraine. Canada cannot forget that regimes in countries such as Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are involved in the axis of aggression against Ukraine. Canada must be consistent in its defense of human rights and democracy around the world, and in the same manner it condemns repression in Venezuela, Belarus, Iran, Zimbabwe, and sanctions corrupt officials and human rights abusers in 21 countries. It should do the same with the Cuban regime. I urge the Trudeau government to stand on the side of the Cuban people, and during the celebration of the 9th Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles next June, to publicly call on the Cuban regime to immediately cease the use of politically motivated repression against the people. This process requires more than just a few occasional statements by a prime minister. It involves actively working for democratic change through parliamentary resolutions, bills, sanctions against human rights violators in Cuba, and actions to stop the financial flow from Canada to Cuba that serves to strengthen the repressive apparatus of the Cuban dictatorship. I encourage all members of the Transatlantic Parliamentary Coalition in the Americas and Europe to strengthen this alliance for Cuba's democracy through bills, resolutions, and other actions. Let us reiterate our commitment to continue rising our voices in legislative chambers, influencing the executive branches and government institutions in all our respective nations, so they may denounce the oppression of the Cuban people, refrain from making unilateral concessions to the regime, demand the release of all Cuban political prisoners, and call on the international community to defend unequivocally human rights in Cuba. Patria y vida, long live free Cuba. Thank you so much.
We in the Cuban Democratic Movement, we are very proud of Senator Roussados and his voice in Canada, actually changing the course of the public policy of that country towards Cuba in the last months, specifically fulfilling the commitments of the Declaración de Miami that he hoped to shake last November. And we have here from senators and the congressman from US, we have here from the senator of Canada, and now we are going to Latin America, and we are going to listen from Senator Felipe Cas, a dear friend and old friend of the cause of freedom, also a personal friend, and very proud of your voice and your defense of human rights everywhere on the stand. It's your floor.
Thank you, Rosa Maria. Thank you, everybody, to be here. So the first thing I want to say here is that I'm very proud for you, Rosa Maria, for what you're doing, for your fight in favor of freedom and democracy. Because when I was a young student, I was only 22 years old, I was studying at the University of La Habana for 1 year. Not because I like communism, but actually exactly for the contrary. I wanted to understand them. And while I was there, I was working with the church, Catholic church there. And I always asked my friends over there in Cuba, who is the biggest leader in the island? Actually, I met my wife, the mother of my 4 children, over there in December 1999. And everybody was saying only one name, your father. He was really a unique human being, a politician, but also a very charismatic and deep leader in all sense of the word. I lived 1 year there. I got married with a Cuban. I have many friends over there. It's very sad when my wife doesn't want to come back to Cuba because she feels very sad. And we are failing. And the reason I came here yesterday from Chile, very far away, is because I think what you're doing here is very important. And please don't stop fighting. Don't stop fighting for democracy, for freedom, because actually Cubans are amazing. You know, I am from Chile, very far away, we are kind of boring, but Cubans are very fun. They are amazing human beings. And it's especially sad that one of the best people in the world are trapped by communism. You know, they're being killed, they're being trapped, they're being basically suffering because of a group of guys who feel they have the power to just privatize an island for themselves. Actually, I went to Cuba as a congressman in 2016. I was working with the lady from White, and they took me into the police office. I was beaten on the floor by them. I was lucky because I had the help from my country, you know? Because they knew a congressman from Chile was actually in the police station. But there are more than 1,000 Cubans that actually are not lucky and they're still in prison because they have nobody to scream for them. And I think Cuba is a big problem for democracy, not only in Cuba, but also in the region. Well, where nobody expected that Venezuela will end up as bad as Cuba, or even worse. Nobody expected that actually Nicaragua will do the same. And nobody expected that actually in my country, Chile, we still have guys who actually support what's going on in Cuba. So the truth is that we are failing as an international community right now. We don't have right now tools, effective tools to protect people. If you're lucky enough, you can escape. If you're not lucky enough, you're poor enough in the context. If you're not willing to risk your life, you're trapped. And that's the truth. So, Rosa Maria, I think we couldn't have a best leader to speak for this cause than you. Count on us. I mean, from Chile, a small country, Latin America. But we really know what it means freedom. We know what it means democracy in Chile. We are proud of our country. We are a good friend of Cubans, and we are a good friend of this Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum because we really think we are at risk. Right now, the extreme left is rising in Latin America. Argentina, we know what's going on right now in Venezuela, we know what's going on in Nicaragua, and we don't know what's going to happen in different countries in Latin America in the future if we don't stand together, if we don't work hard in the streets with the people. So what you're doing is amazing, so thank you for inviting me to be here, and we hope that we can really make change, real change, with the help of everybody, for the Cuba, for Nicaragua, and for Venezuela.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Cass. We are counting on your leadership, on the leadership of each of the parliamentarians that integrate this forum. We welcome Congresswoman María Salazar to the room, a very brave voice for the cause of freedom, and we also appreciate the friendship that only Cuban people, that happy Cuban people that have been suffering for 6 decades now have found in your people, in the Chilean people, and in many Chilean politicians too. Thank you so much, Senator. And this is a transatlantic forum. We listen to North America, Latin America, and now we are passing the floor to our dear friend, member of the Spanish Parliament, Victor González de Coelho. El floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Rosa Maria, for organizing this forum. Thanks for previous speakers, to all the authorities for being here. We were in Miami last year, a year ago. It was really important to be back. I can see two of my colleagues on the screen. I see Herman Terz, who's a member of the European Parliament, who's been wonderful work in the European Parliament, and I see our speakers. I'm also happy that I'm seeing members of all political parties. I see another member of the European Parliament for another political force, and I see another member of the Spanish Parliament for another political purposes. I think it's really good that we all gather together to fight for freedom in Cuba. Senator Scott mentioned about the European Union and how important it was for Latin America. I have to say, for Europe and it is for Spain. I know about it in the Western world, the communists are part of the coalition that is leading the government of Spain nowadays. And we can say they are good friends and they were trained in Cuba and Venezuela. We need to finance, actually, by these guys. So we share that common enemy. We have a goal, and you know that the goal is to stop financing from Europe and Spain. This dictatorship that is governing Cuba for so long. All I can say is I'm more than happy. It's really hard for me as Speaker of the Affairs Commission of the Spanish Parliament to hear some of the members say that Cuba is a consolidated democracy. That's something that Cuba is saying a number of good times in the Spanish Parliament by the members of Podemos. This is one of the political parties that has the government in Spain. So that's why we're fighting, and I think we need to fight for truth. And I hope this list is really happy with the tools you have provided. I hope we start looking for these people, properties, assets, and try to put an embargo on them. And the same for the military elite that we're providing us. So thanks for your work, thanks for your leadership, and that's all I can say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Congressman Victor. Thank you for your friendship. You are one of the founders of this parliamentary forum, and you were so right in our point that this is a forum that has as single goal the freedom of Cuba and the respect for democracy and human rights everywhere. And for that, and to that cause, everybody is invited. That's why we are a forum made by politicians that commit to the greatest of the cause, which is freedom. Freedom in their countries and the protection of their countries, but also freedom for the Cuban people. And that's why we are so proud to have in this forum a representative of different parties, different opinions, different positions in the political spectrum, but everybody committed with the same purpose: the freedom of Cuba, the persecution of real actions from the international community, from the government, towards the protection and the support of the Cuban people. So thank you so much. And with that, I would love to give the floor to a member of the European Parliament that is also a founder of this Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum from Spain, our dear friend, José Ramón Bauzá. Mike?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you, dear Rosa Maria, your invitation, and obviously your efforts to bring democracy every single day to Cuba. This forum is a big sample for it, and I heartily hope that this forum will soon bear fruit. I'm absolutely sure. Secondly, I'm going to reiterate what we already know, but I think sometimes it doesn't matter to reiterate a little bit more. Today, Cuba is not free. We absolutely will know. Today, Cuba is not a democracy. Today, Cuba is not. It is a dictatorship ruled by a gang of murderers and rebels. And it has been that this way for the last 16 years. In Cuba, citizens don't have political rights, nor free speech. Instead, there are over 1,000 political prisoners who do not enjoy the right for trial. And Cuban trials are a mockery to the true justice. I'm going to reiterate as well that the FDNF is but a figurehead for the Castro family, who in truth keep control of the island, and it was a big temptation. And for the last 60 years, they have been personally responsible for the suffering of the Cuban people. I'm going to reiterate as well that any illusion of democratic reform which Castro regime tried to fool the international community in the past years was merely that, an illusion, a mirage. Today, nothing is left even of that mirage. Cuba actively supports the restoration of democracy in other Latin American countries and has recently backed up Russia's invasion of Ukraine, acting as a spreader for the propaganda of the Vladimir Putin regime and condoning its war crimes. This we all know, but let me tell you what I'm forced to reiterate. It is because in the West, there are always people who do not know, people who fail to know, from useful items, as many label as that, to willing accomplices. All the democratic societies are packed with this kind of people. As a Spaniard, I warn you all, dear friends, do not let this kind of people go unchecked, or you can find yourself being ruled by them. Today, these people make up the ruling coalition in Spain, in my country. The far-left Unidas Podemos party, which is the legal partner of the coalition, has been the Trojan horse that has allowed Spanish companies to re-enter the government for the first time since the famous Civil War, when they were working for Stalin. At least 2 ministers are affiliates of the Spanish Communist Party, beginning with our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Labor. This is the same woman who wrote a heartfelt farewell to Fidel Castro on Twitter for all those to see when the late dictator died, she affectionately called him comandante. Unidas Podemos minister would refuse to call Cuban a dictatorship whenever they are called or put micro just in front of their faces. And at the same time, they have no problem in saying that Spain, the country that they govern, is flavored in democracy. The refusal of calling Cuba for what it is has even spread to the major partnership in the coalition, the Socialist Party. Last year, when the courageous Cuban people protested and cried "Patria y vida," gaining the admiration and respect of all democracy in the world, Spanish ministers of the Socialist Party repeatedly avoided calling Castro regime a dictatorship when insistently asked by Europe. He always said, quote, "It is not a democracy. Even if it's not a democracy, it can only be a dictatorship." If the ministers were waiting for any further proof after 60 years of Cuba being a dictatorship, many of those gallant protesters are now sentenced to over 30 years of imprisonment after sharp trades. Spain certainly needs to get rid of this ruinous socialist communist coalition, and it work every single day as a member of the European Parliament, hoping that this shameful government, who has no equal in Europe, the European Union, will be democratically ousted of the next general election. But for Cubans to conquer their freedom, it is absolutely necessary what we in the Western countries fight at home, the accomplices of the Cuban dictatorship. Bear in mind that they spread the Castrist propaganda and thus they weaken like shepherds the West's response to the abuses and repression of the Castro regime against the whole people. So I would like to end my intervention by saying, be reiterative. Never stop calling this for what they are, as many times as you can. One more time, calling Cuba a dictatorship is never enough. And I want to finish, dear Rosa Maria, yes, two reflections. First of all, what Hugo has said about the letter sent by my dear colleague Peter Sanchez. We are working hand by hand every single day in order to prove what Cuba really is doing. Every single day, non-stop. We know what is in front of us. We know what Mr. Borrell is saying and doing every single day. We have several papers with several resolutions. We have several amendments. We have any kind of document, but we have to stay just in front of them every single day. And it's one of my responsibility, and it's one of the things I want to put on the table. And finally, yes, every time I talk about the Cuban regime and about the prisoners that are in jail every single day as well, and Rosa Maria knows very well, it's my responsibility was to name one very good friend who is in jail with any kind of, not free obviously, but any kind of human rights. That is my friend, Jose Daniel Ferrer. I talk every single day, no, but twice, 3 times in a week with his sister, is Annabelle Gish. And let's not forget what is happening with him. He's in a jail that is no more than 2 square meters with very small piece not in the door, but even in the floor where he can breathe with the less human conditions, with not medical conditions, with nothing that we can imagine, as you very well know. Don't forget even to call his name every single day. This is one other thing I want to say. So, Rosa Maria, thank you so much for giving me this kind of opportunity. And thank you to all of you for different institutions to be helping for this cause that we will have a finishing date, and we are now step by step. Thank you so much. Congratulations, and all the best to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your voice and your friendship. And you just mentioned Vice President Dita Sharantsova from the European Union. She cannot be here with us today. She's also a founder of this forum, but she's sent us a message by video, and I ask you all please to direct your attention to the screen to listen from Vice President Dita Sharazov.
Ladies and gentlemen, I regret that I cannot join you in person today, but I'm happy to have this opportunity to address the Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for Free Cuba. I wanted to thank Rosa Maria Paya for organizing this meeting. I'm addressing you from Strasbourg, the heart of Europe, at a moment when the future of our continent is at stake. Ukrainians are fighting not just for their own security, they are fighting for the security of Europe. But this is not just a European issue, it is a geopolitical one. We are witnessing a change in the post-Cold War order. We need allies all over the world, including the Americas, to stand up to dictators like Putin with us. We are now seeing more clearly than ever who the EU's allies are, and Cuba chose the side of war criminal Vladimir Putin. Most of you know that I was critical for many years of the EU's partnership with Cuba due to human rights violations. But Cuba supporting Putin and his war in Ukraine is the final straw. We cannot keep our ties with Putin's allies. And this is especially more important now than ever to strengthen our support to the democratic forces from Cuba and in other countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua. I wanted to end by saying, in the context of this forum, that I'm very happy with the close cooperation between the European Union and the US in its response to Russian brutality in Ukraine. We also need these strong transatlantic ties when it comes to addressing other dictatorships worldwide, not least in Cuba.
Exactly, and so she has imposed just this week, Vice President Charanzova and Leopoldo López Gil, also member of the European Parliament, signed a letter to Joseph Borrell asking for isolating the dictatorship of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and specifically pointing out their relationship and the strengthening of their links with the Putin regime. With that, I will first welcome to this room Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, and also pass the floor to member of the Parliament of Spain, Pablo Ispan. Yours is the floor.
Hello, Rosa Maria. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to say that I'm a member of the Popular Party, a party that we were very close friends and very close allies of your father, Osvaldo. Hello, my dear colleagues from all parliaments from both sides of the Atlantic. I want also to congratulate Rosa Maria for this initiative. We need more transatlantic initiative to coordinate our policies in the question of Cuba and other issues about freedom. I want to say two things only. It is going to be a very brief intervention. First of all, we are very worried. We're very worried about what's happening now in Cuba after the spring of the July demonstrations against the regime. The winter of repression has arrived to Cuba, and there are a lot of political prisoners that are suffering punishment by the regime, and this is being high at the public opinion. This is not a question in our public opinion, in our democracy, and we need to do more for them. we are also very worried about what the government of Spain is doing. The former MD, the European Parliament also told us, told everybody that we are in Spain, we have a social communist government that is a close ally of the Cuban regime, not only the communist members, also the socialist member. Spanish government is one of the big support of the Cuban regime. And I think it's well to know to everybody. Spain is Spanish government is doing whatever it can for make the Cuban government survive. And for finishing my intervention, I want to propose three things. I think, Rosa, that we need more coordination among us, among us MPs, about to present initiative about the release of all the political prisoners. I think that all together can, on the view that we support the Council of Freedom of Cuba, can present the same proposal for the release of the MPs. Also, as Leopoldo Lopez has, it's an MP of my political party at the European Parliament, we must denunciate all the links between Cuba and Russia. So enlarge all the sanctions that we are punishing to Russia against also to its allies, and especially especially Cuba. So Cuba must suffer the same sanctions that its partnership Cuba. And the third proposal is to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the assassination of your father, Osvaldo, and make a big event in both sides of the Atlantic to remember the figure of your father and the example that he was for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you so much for that recognition of my father's legacy and the fact that he was murdered 10 years ago. I'm looking forward that event in both sides of the Atlantic to commemorate his life and also to call the attention of all the Cubans that are suffering and are actually in danger to have to suffer the same fate that my father and Harrison Better suffered 10 years ago. Thank you so much. Your proposals, your other proposals are part of the draft document that is going to be, if the parliamentarians approve, the declaration of Washington DC. Thank you so much. With that, I would love to pass the floor to a dear friend and old friend, also founder of this forum, member of the European Parliament, Mr. Herman Tersch.
Yes. Hello to everybody. Thank you very much, Rosa Maria. Yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for being there. I would have loved to be in Washington, but I'm now here, and I'm prisoner now of COVID in this moment in Spain, here to my credit. Not in a very good shape. Anyway, I wanted to be present because I think it's absolutely necessary that we insist first in the unique question of Cuba. Cuba is the head of the group. Cuba is the head of the whole organization, which is making so much suffering and is creating so much trouble in democracies, and is supporting the increasing dictatorships and regimes, authoritarian regimes in the subcontinent. But I wanted only, I have no time, I wanted only to insist on one question, which is very important, which is the Spanish link. I mean, we have Zapatero was now in Cuba and is now in Colombia. He's doing his job now for the electoral campaign of Petro. He was with Boric. He was in Peru. He is one of the links of this Foro de Sao Paulo, which is everywhere. but which has command and control in Cuba. And it's all about also the narcotics. We have all the drug connections, which are they are intertwined with the ideological movements, with the parties, with all these enterprises which are working with them, with foundations. It's an enormous network. We have a network against that is very important, but we have to be very clear that they have penetrated very profoundly. Also, the Spanish society, the Spanish government, the socialist party. Not only my good friend Baltas spoke about the communists. Of course, the communists are there because they are the FARC and the ALN from Colombia, which are Cuba and which obey orders of Cuba and who are coordinated with Cuba and with all of them. The important question is Spain, and that's why we have this enormous trouble with Borrell and with the team of Borrell in the European Union, with enormous consequences, is that the Socialist Party, the Spanish Socialist Party, is completely linked to all these movements, and it has obedience and submission to the interests which are not Spanish, which are not from the Socialist Party, but are from foreign countries and from foreign forces. And this is one of the major issues that we have to tackle with. And as I say, Borrell is a problem, his team is a problem, many people in the European Union are a problem, and the Socialist Party in the European Union coordinates with the Cuban embassy or their political work on Latin America. That is the case, and so we have to be aware of that. In case I stop there. I thank you very much for attention, and I hope you have a very good work, and I'm looking forward to see you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Congressman Herman Terz, for those firm words. And with that, I would like to welcome to the room Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart and pass the floor to Congresswoman Nicole Maliotakis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Rosa Maria, it's wonderful to have you here in Washington. You've been a wonderful asset to this fight for free Cuba. Some people on the screen may not know, my name is Maliotakis. My father is Greek, but my mother is a Cuban refugee who fled the Castro regime in 1969. My grandfather, my uncle, cousins that are there. Unfortunately, my grandfather passed away. But the reality is, we all know that the situation there is dire. People are starving. There's basic things that you need to survive. Things like aspirin, things like toilet paper, food. Everything is scarce, and even if you have money that is provided to you through remittances, you send your family there, they still can't buy anything because the shelves are bare. And it's just unbelievable to hear the stories of how the Cuban people are suffering 60 years later. I think it's a great opportunity for us right now, because here in Congress we have the most Cuban Americans representing than any time prior. I think there's 10 of us now between the Senate and the House. And we've worked together to try to sound the alarm, and over the summer, doing whatever we can on social media to try to expose what is happening, about how young people are being jailed, how innocent people, innocent protesters are being abused, attacked, being killed by this regime. I think we need to work together to continue that, get those video footages, whatever we can get out into social media, educate the American people about what is happening 90 miles from our shores. Unfortunately, at that time, and I felt we were making very good progress, there's been a lot of pressure on this administration. Unfortunately, at that time, Afghanistan occurred, and everyone got sidetracked onto Afghanistan. And then now we're dealing with this problem with Ukraine. And I try to tie it together and show. I'm a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm also a ranking member of the International Development. but try to use this as an opportunity to tie it all together because, Russia has extreme influence, as does China. 90 miles from our shores. We should be deeply concerned about that. The fact that there is intelligence activity, military activity, so close to us, it poses a national security threat. So when people say, why should we care? Well, we should care. I mean, we care personally because our families there are suffering, but everyone should care in this country simply because of the fact that they are so close and they are aligned with adversaries during a time when we are very close to very close to a potential world war. So I really urge the administration to look at this more closely and listen to what we're saying, what we're warning about. We warned about Afghanistan. If you didn't do certain things, that we were going to have a botched withdrawal, the Taliban would take control. Look what happened. That's exactly what happened. Then we warned that we could have stopped this war in Russia, this invasion, if we had done certain things early on to deter Putin. And now we're warning about this. So I hope the administration will pay closer attention. I think that we all need to work together through this organization to echo the videos, sound bites, expose what is happening in Cuba and the daily struggles of the people for freedom and starvation, all the things that are happening there. We need to work together to expose it. I think that if I can really leave one thing here today, I think in order to get everyone's attention, people that need to have their attention, we need to speak with a more unified voice and echo what your organization is putting out, getting it out there so that the American people see it and see how outrageous it is, what is occurring there. So I thank you for having me. I look forward to continuing to work with you. And again, someone who has family there is something more I want to see from free Cuba and seeing them have the same opportunities that we have in this great country.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you were so right in pointing out the necessity of using the public platforms to shine a light on the Cuban situation. Thank you so much for doing so with your personal platforms, and of course you also encourage that on the Miami Declaration and your final declaration today in San And with that, I would like to pass the floor to the dear friend Iván Espinosa Los Monteros, member of the Spanish Parliament. Iván, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you in Spain. Many thanks to Rosa Maria Payá, Cuba de Chile, and the Foundation for the Pan-American Democracy for the invitation to join in this edition of Transatlantic Parliamentary Forum for Free Cuba. Now, this meeting is very important. It is very necessary because it sends, I think, an essential message to Cubans on the island, which is you are not alone. On the contrary, more voices on both sides of the Atlantic, and all over the world, in fact, rising up to condemn a criminal regime and that Cubans have the right to have rights. Thousands of Cubans have been crying out for freedom all these decades, while the communist regime has been imprisoning, torturing, murdering, and condemning to exile those who dare to ask. There have been many. Some were writers like Alberto Padilla, Reinaldo Arenas, María Elena or Guillermo Capitán. Others perhaps were artists like Luis Manuel de Alcántara, Semper Bueno, or Michael Osorio. Still, others were independent journalists such as Raúl Rivero or Rafa Yuri. Also, human rights activists like Profil, Gustavo Arcos, or Oscar Díaz-Vidal, and of course, political leaders like Osvaldo Payá, whom we will never forget, were murdered by the Castro regime. Cuban political dissidents are reference to dignity for the world. They have been joined by an increasing amount of people, and after demonstrations of July 11th, the intensity of this cry for freedom is deafening. There is no room for silence. There is no room for acting as if nothing had happened. According to human rights organizations, since July, repression in Cuba has reached levels only comparable to those from the beginnings of the current regime, or perhaps from the Islam crisis. But the Cuban regime of the threat extends well beyond its own borders. As we have pointed out repeatedly in books, with the Charter of Madrid, Cuba is the umbrella. Cuba is the brain and the driving force behind
organizations such as the Foro Sao Paulo or the Puebla Group, through which they try to impose their ideological agenda throughout the American continent. Now, once again, the same regime that once offered sanctuary for guerrillas, for terrorists, first around the world, has chosen the side of evil and become one of Russia's international allies in the cruel and bloody invasion of Ukraine. Step taken by the UN Human Rights Council to suspend Russia's membership is important, but it will not be enough if it is not consistent. The same measures not taken with those countries that systematically violate human rights across the world. Cuba cannot continue to be a member of the UN Human Rights Council because its presence is insult to injury to those who continue to suffer the rigors of the Cuban prisons. Governments in Spain and Europe cannot move the other way. As I said here, Spain is being too easy on the Cuban regime. First step is the immediate and urgent activation of the political dialogue and cooperation agreement between the EU and Cuba. We need to demand respect for human rights and end repression and